Here's something strange. Ask a 5-year-old to try a new food, sit in a different seat, or play a game with rules nobody explained to them, and most of the time they just do it. Maybe they complain for 10 seconds, then they move on. Now ask your uncle to switch from his flip phone. Ask your grandmother to try the self-checkout at the grocery store instead of the cashier she's used for 15 years. Ask a 60-year-old coworker to learn the new software the company just rolled out. Suddenly, you're not dealing with 10 seconds of complaining. You're dealing with a wall butt, and here's the part that trips most people up. It's not that older people are stubborn. It's not that they're set in their ways because they're lazy or closed-minded. That's the lazy explanation, and it's mostly wrong. Something is actually happening inside the brain, inside the body, inside the whole architecture of how a person relates to the world that makes change feel like a genuinely different experience once you hit a certain age. And once you understand what that something is, you'll never look at a resistant parent, a rigid boss, or even your own future self the same way again. Because, and I mean this, you are going to become this person. This isn't a video about them. It's a preview of you, running about 30 or 40 years ahead of schedule. So stick around, because by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly why your brain will fight you on change later in life, what's actually happening biologically when that resistance kicks in, and, this is the important part, what you can do right now, at whatever age you're watching this, to make sure you don't turn into the person who can't handle anything new. Let's get into it. Part 1. The experiment that started this. Back in the 1990s, a psychologist named Laura Carstensen was watching something odd happen in her research data. She was studying how people's social lives changed as they aged, and she expected the usual sad story: older people getting lonelier, more isolated, their social circles shrinking because, well, life does that to you. People move away, people die, retirement takes away the built-in social structure of a workplace. But that's not actually what the data showed. What she found was that older adults weren't losing their social lives by accident. They were doing it on purpose. They were actively cutting people out: old classmates, distant acquaintances, that one coworker they never really liked, gone. And they were doing this while reporting that they were happier, more emotionally stable, and more satisfied with the relationships they did keep. This became one of the most important ideas in the psychology of aging. It's called socio-emotional selectivity theory, and the basic idea is this: when you're young, your brain treats time as basically unlimited. You don't know exactly when you'll die, but it feels far away, abstract, not worth thinking about. So your brain optimizes for information. I want to meet new people, try new restaurants, take a job in a new city, learn things, expand, and gather. That's the whole strategy of youth. Cast a wide net, because you've got decades to sort out what's actually useful. But somewhere in midlife something flips. Time stops feeling unlimited. Maybe a parent dies. Maybe you hit a birthday that makes the math uncomfortable. Maybe you just start noticing how fast a decade actually goes once you've lived through a few of them. And when time starts to feel limited, the brain switches strategies. It stops optimizing for information and starts optimizing for meaning. That's why older people don't want 50 acquaintances. They want 3 people who actually matter. That's why they don't want to try 5 new restaurants this month. They want to go back to the one they already know is good. This isn't decline. It's a completely rational shift in priorities once your brain recalibrates how much time it thinks you have left. And here's the piece that connects directly to our topic. Change is, by definition, a step into the unknown. When you're young and optimizing for information, the unknown is exciting. It's where the good stuff is hiding. When you're older and optimizing for meaning, the unknown is a threat. It's a place where you might waste the time you don't have much of anymore on something that doesn't pan out. So the first reason aging changes how we handle change isn't really about the brain getting worse. It's about the brain getting smarter about what it thinks matters. The tragedy is that this smart trade-off sometimes gets applied to the wrong things, like refusing to learn a new skill that would actually make life easier, because the emotional machinery doesn't always know the difference between "this is a waste of my limited time" and This is scary and unfamiliar. Part 2. What's actually happening in the brain? Okay, so that's the psychology. But there's also real biology going on. And this part is honestly kind of wild once you see it laid out. Your brain runs on something called dopamine. And dopamine isn't just the feel-good chemical people talk about. It's much more specifically the "this might be worth pursuing" chemical. It's what fires when you're anticipating something new. A new place, a new person, a new possibility. It's the chemical of curiosity itself. And dopamine production and dopamine receptor density both decline with age. Not a little findy, studies looking at dopamine receptors across the adult lifespan have found reductions of something like 10% per decade in some regions of the brain. By the time you're 70, some of that dopamine machinery is running at a fraction of what it was doing at 20. Think about what that actually means on a felt, lived level. Novelty used to trigger a little internal reward. Ooh, what's this feeling? As dopamine sensitivity drops, that reward gets quieter. The new thing doesn't spark curiosity the way it used to. It just registers as effort with no payoff attached. Of course, an older brain would rather stick with the version of the world it already has a working relationship with. The chemical incentive to explore has been quietly turned down. Then there's the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for what's called cognitive flexibility. This is your ability to hold two ideas at once, to update a plan midstream, to say, okay, the situation changed, let me adjust. This region is one of the last parts of the brain to fully mature, usually not until your mid-20s, and it's also one of the first to show measurable age-related changes, sometimes starting as early as your 30s in subtle ways. Cognitive flexibility is basically the mental muscle you use every single time you handle change. New app interface? That's cognitive flexibility. New route because of construction? Cognitive flexibility. New manager with a different way of running meetings? Same thing. And as that specific muscle weakens with age, not disappears, but weakens, every one of those situations takes more effort than it used to. It's not that older people can't adapt. It's that adapting now costs more energy than it did before. And the brain, quite reasonably, starts looking for ways to avoid paying that cost. There's also a structural thing happening called myelin degradation. Myelin is the fatty coating around your neurons that lets electrical signals travel fast and clean, kind of like insulation on a wire. As we age, myelin naturally thins in places, and this slows down the speed at which different brain regions can talk to each other. Processing speed drops, and processing speed matters enormously for handling change, because change usually means dealing with something in real time, on the spot, without a script, reading a new sign, following new instructions, figuring out a new system while someone's standing there waiting for you. So when you put it together, less dopamine reward for novelty, weaker cognitive flexibility, slower processing speed, you get a brain that isn't broken, but is genuinely working under different conditions. Resistance to change in older age isn't a personality flaw. It's the predictable output of a brain running on different fuel with different wiring. Part 3, the body gets a vote too. Here's something people rarely talk about, and I think it might actually be the biggest piece of this entire puzzle. Change doesn't just tax the brain, it taxes the body. And the body's ability to absorb that tax changes dramatically with age. There's a concept in physiology called allostatic load. Basically, every stressful event in your life, and yes, even a small change like a new grocery store layout counts as stress to your nervous system, triggers a cascade of hormones. Cortisol goes up, heart rate goes up, blood pressure goes up. Your body mobilizes resources to deal with the disruption. In a young, healthy system, this response fires, does its job, and then shuts back off efficiently. You recover. But allostatic load accumulates over a lifetime. Every stressor you've ever weathered leaves a tiny bit of wear on the system, on your cardiovascular system, your immune system, your hormonal regulation. By the time you're 60 or 70, that system has absorbed decades of wear, and it doesn't reset as efficiently anymore. Cortisol takes longer to come back down after a stressful event. The whole recovery curve gets longer and shakier, which means that for an older person, adapting to change isn't just a mental exercise. It's a genuine physiological event that their body now has less reserve capacity to absorb gracefully. When your 78-year-old grandfather gets visibly rattled because his usual pharmacy switched to an automated phone system, he's not being dramatic. His stress response is doing exactly what stress responses do, except now it's happening in a body that doesn't bounce back from it as fast as it used to. And this creates something important to understand: a vicious cycle. Change causes stress. Stress in an aging body lingers longer and feels worse. That lingering bad feeling gets mentally filed away as change equals bad. So the next time change shows up, the anticipation alone triggers the stress response before anything has even happened. Over years, this can calcify into what looks like stubbornness from the outside, but is actually a learned, physiologically reinforced avoidance pattern. The brain isn't being difficult on purpose. It's protecting a body that has genuinely gotten more fragile in how it handles disruption. Part 4. The comfort of the known self. There's one more layer here, and it's less about neurons and hormones, and more about identity itself. By the time someone reaches their 50s, 60s, 70s, they've built an entire internal story about who they are. Decades of decisions, routines, preferences, and hard-won competencies have crystallized into a stable sense of self. Psychologists sometimes call this ego integrity, the sense that your life adds up to something coherent, that you know who you are and what you stand for. Change threatens that story in a very specific way. Learning a brand new skill as a 65-year-old doesn't just mean learning the skill. It means, for a moment, becoming a beginner again. And being a beginner means being incompetent, confused, slow, possibly embarrassed in front of people who are used to seeing you as capable. For someone who has spent 40 years building a professional identity as the person who knows what they're doing, voluntarily stepping into a room where they don't know what they're doing can feel less like an inconvenience and more like an attack on who they are. This is why you'll sometimes see a retired executive who ran an entire company for 30 years absolutely refuse to ask their grandkid for help setting up a new phone. It's not about the phone. It's about the discomfort of temporarily inhabiting the identity of person who doesn't know things, after decades of being the person who did. Younger people don't have this problem nearly as much, because their identity is still under construction. Being a beginner is just normal. It's the default state. There's very little to protect because the story isn't finished yet. But an older person is often defending a completed narrative, and every unfamiliar situation is a small threat to the ending they've already written for themselves. Part 5. So what actually helps? Okay, here's where this stops being just an interesting explanation and starts being useful. If you're watching this and thinking about a parent or grandparent who seems impossibly rigid, the first shift is simply this: stop interpreting the resistance as a character flaw. It's not laziness, and it's not stubbornness for its own sake. It's a brain running lower on novelty reward chemistry, working with a slower processing system, sitting inside a body that recovers from stress more slowly, all while trying to protect a hard-earned sense of identity. Once you see it that way, you stop fighting the person and start working with the actual obstacle. Practically, that means introducing change in smaller pieces, with more time, and without an audience. Don't hand your dad the new smart TV remote in front of the whole family at Thanksgiving and expect him to figure it out on the spot. That's basically guaranteed to trigger the identity threat response we just talked about. Show him privately, slowly, let him fumble without anyone watching, and let him repeat it a few times until it becomes familiar rather than foreign. Framing matters too. This is going to replace what you know, lands very differently than this does the same thing you're used to, just with one extra step. The brain we described earlier isn't against efficiency, it's against the feeling of starting over from zero. If you can show someone that 90% of their existing knowledge still applies, the resistance usually drops dramatically. Now, if you're younger and watching this, here's the part that actually matters most for you long term. All of this decline we've talked about, the dopamine drop, the flexibility loss, the slower stress recovery, none of it is fixed in stone. It's a trajectory, not a guarantee. And there's real research showing that people who keep deliberately exposing themselves to novelty throughout adulthood, new skills, new environments, new social situations, maintain higher cognitive flexibility, and even show different patterns of dopamine sensitivity later in life compared to people who let their routines calcify early. In other words, the brain that resists change at 70 is often a brain that stopped practicing change at 40. Cognitive flexibility works like an actual muscle. Use it consistently, and the decline is slower and shallower. Stop using it. Settle into a life where every day looks exactly like the last one, where you stop trying new things because it's easier not to, and you accelerate the exact process we just spent this whole video describing. So if there's one thing to take from all of this, it's this. The habit of trying new things isn't a personality trait some people have and others don't. It's a practice, and like any practice, it's a lot easier to keep going than it is to restart after decades of not doing it. The 65-year-old who still travels somewhere unfamiliar, still picks up new hobbies, still lets themselves be a beginner at something on purpose, that person isn't lucky. They just never let the habit die. So now you know why change gets harder with age. The dopamine, the flexibility, the stress recovery, the identity protection, all of it working together. But here's a question that naturally follows, and it's honestly even more unsettling. If the brain resists new information as it ages, what happens to the beliefs someone forms early in life and never questions again? How do people end up absolutely convinced of something that isn't even true, and stay convinced for 50 years? That's exactly what we're getting into next. The psychology of why some beliefs become impossible to shake, no matter how much evidence stacks up against them. Click the next video and let's dig into it.